How many of you think that the news media is heavily polarized today? I do not see any hands, which probably means that you don't think that the news media is heavily polarized today. But let's look at some statistics. So apparently this has been taken in from a research which was conducted in 2017 by the Gallup Knight Foundation, and it has been compared to a research that occurred in 1984. Probably like 30 years of difference. And as you can see, the number of people who think that the news media is heavily polarized today has increased sharply from 42% to 66%. What they basically think is that the biases of the news media personnel themselves sort of creep into their reporting of stories, which is why people have started to lose faith in the institution of news media. In fact, a lot of studies have been conducted about the perception of various people about various news organizations. For example, this study is from the UK, which is the United Kingdom. And these are the mainstream newspapers from UK. And as you can see, a lot of people have different perceptions of where these newspapers stand when it comes to their biases. So as you can see, a lot of people seem to think, most of the people seem to think that the news media only slightly leans, because you see the numbers over here are larger than the numbers on the edges, which basically mean very left wing or very right wing. Similarly, there's another chart that exists for the US media. So over here, you can see some of the news agencies which you've probably heard about. There's BuzzFeed, there's CNN, ABC, BBC, and each of them, this was a survey conducted by All Slides in 2021, and they came up with this chart to tell us what people's perception is. So as you can see over here, they reflect perspective only, which basically means that according to people's perception, the news media can be divided into these 5 categories, starting from left wing to right wing. So why should we study this phenomenon? Why should we study the polarization or the perception of the news media being polarized? I will give you 3 reasons. There could be more, but these 3 reasons are something that I think are the most important reasons. So a question to ponder about is, will the usage of natural language processing be as common as statistics one day? We all know what statistics are. All of us who work in STEM backgrounds use statistics in our day-to-day life. Statistics was popularized in the 15th century. Now it's a common tool. It's so common, like everyone knows about statistics. It is used to describe a variety of phenomena in scientific domains, including biology and astronomy. We can use statistics because the language of science, the underlying language of science is mathematics, right? But what about society? What is the language that society uses? The language that society uses is the language that we talk in, the language that we write in. That is the language of laws, it's the language of a judiciary, it's the language of social sciences and humanity in general, right? So say we can use natural language processing to quantify language itself. That means that we sort of convert our own language into a sort of math-ish structure. And that is how we can sort of study social phenomena. I believe it is important for us to quantify every social phenomena that occurs every day into a mathematical form so that we can analyze it and gain some sort of conclusions from it, which is why we should study this phenomenon. The second reason is to quantify the biases in language. Um, all of us must probably be well aware that the usage of human language has a lot of biases. For example, we use a concept called master slaves in our day-to-day life. There's a master server, there are slave servers that follow the master server, but we've never thought of the connotation of what this language actually means. In computer science, we also use the term blacklist to blacklist certain websites that we think are harmful to our organizations, but we never think of why we use the word Black. While we can think of these phenomena as the cultural markers of a politically incorrect time, they are triggering for people who have been at the receiving end of such cultural barbs. So this is something that needs to be studied, and we have to make sure that we do not repeat the mistakes that have occurred in history. And lastly, social responsibility. We all know that social media sites across the world today, they grapple with hate speech, they have a lot of genocidal material, they have a lot of harassment, and there's literally teams in every social media organization which defines like their policy. Social media has sort of started interacting with us in like our physical life as well, and we can see that some of our policymakers, the people who make our laws, the legislatures, the judiciary, they're all looking at social media, and that is how our policies are being framed to them. So as policy scientists look up the various biases in our justice system's usage of language, and as most of the people in the world struggle with what is globally called a media bias, I believe that as mathematics and statistics became commonplace measures, so will machine learning models. This basically means that one day machine learning models will dictate what our next policy will be. Already, we are using statistics and mathematics to determine that, but in the future, it will be machine learning models. So this work is an example of an intersection of a non-scientific field, which is like social science with computer science and mathematics, trying to quantify, measure, and identify non-mathematical phenomena in the language of mathematics. It is important because it could be the basis of these scientific approaches that the next generation policymakers, voters, nonprofit social organizations, and governments could use to make life-changing decisions for their citizens. So how polarized is the news media really? And how does one quantify it? This is the point at which we are sort of trying to frame a social phenomenon into a question that machine learning can answer. So the definition of the news media, now when we are looking at a particular problem statement, we determine the scope of that particular problem statement. So for this particular problem statement, we define the scope of what we mean by news for this particular experiment. In my experiments, I used established news organizations. I did not use personal blog sites. I did not even use certain shows like The Daily Show or The View or Fox and Friends, which are actually consumed by certain people for their news, but they're not really news shows. The organizations are also not news organizations, or the channels that they sort of stream on. Online content on their websites and articles, which included opinion pieces, were included in the study, and no social media content was included. So this is basically our problem statement. We have sort of looked at a social phenomena, and we have come up to a problem statement that can be fed into like a machine learning model. So what we're doing over here is we're studying the varying level of polarization induced in a neural network by feeding it newspaper articles with manufactured sentiments according to the all-slice media bias chart for the level of faith people on various aisles of the political spectrum have. So basically our X, in simple terms, our X will be the vector, which is a vector of either the article or the headline of that particular article, and Y is the credence. Credence basically means the faith of a particular person on one aisle of a political spectrum. Like for example, if we go back to our chart, you can see over here, say I am a left-leaning person, so I would have most faith in the organizations over here, and I would have least faith on the organizations over here. So what we're trying to determine is whether perspective actually translates to something that can be quantified using natural language processing or not. Some related work or state-of-the-art methods that have already been used to try to quantify these phenomenon are as follows. There was an online news media bias analysis, which was conducted using an LDA NLP approach. This was done quite a long ago. That was the time when NLP had not evolved to include neural networks. So it was done using a bag of words methodology. We have we in the NLP field have sort of moved further than the bag of words approach. So we have better models that we can use now. There was also a political ideology detection using RNNs, except the political ideology was like the database that was used over here was a database of political speeches and not news. Then there was another study that was conducted that was called Identification and Analysis of Media Bias in News Article. This was done by Newsbird, which is an aggregator that presents shared and different information on topics. So this particular paper was a database, like they literally created a database. There was one more, which was quantifying perceived political bias of newspapers through a document classification technique. Some of my work is sort of based off this paper. They used a documentation classification technique, which is something that I have used for some of my database, for some of my data, because I've used quite diverse data. So for some, I had the article information, for some I did not. Another one is media bias, the social sciences, and NLP, automating frame analysis to identify bias by word choice and labeling. Word choice, this particular work was actually looking at only words or at word choices rather than like the entire sentence or the article or any sort of political bias. It was actually looking at how different organizations would look at the same thing. Like, for example, one organization called a particular group of people terrorists, the other organization called them a group of freedom fighters. The last one is detecting media bias in news article using Gaussian bias distributions. This used hand annotated data, which was something that I did not have, which is why I did not follow this methodology. So I used multiple data sets for my experiment. Some of the data sets that I used for this project are as follows. I used a COVID data set, which had UK and US based media. It was compiled by this company called Island. Then there was topic-based 200,000 news headlines from the year 2012 to 2018. They say 2016 was the worst times to live in terms of news polarization, which is why this particular data set was of significance. Then I used NELA 2017, all the news Kaggle. Both of these data sets have been compiled by Kaggle. The other data set that I used was EMNLP Basel data set. So we went through some of the related work, right? So the Basel data set is one of the works here. So one of the paper published was actually a data set. It was an introduction to a data set, which was the EMNLP Basel data set. Also, a fake news data set was compiled using news headlines from the Spoof, which is an online journal that publishes fake news as satire or jokes. Why we're looking at fake news is something that I'll come to in the later part of this presentation. So let's look at the design of this experiment. Whenever we are designing an experiment, we define certain specifications of that experiment. Some of the choices that I had to make was whether to use document encoding or sentence encoding. For all of the data sets, I did not have entire articles. Only for some data sets, I had entire articles, which meant that for some, I had to use document encoding for the entire article. And for the others, I used sentence encoding just for the headlines. So what happens when you have only the headlines and not the articles? Would you say that a headline is a good representation of a bias? The answer is yes. In fact, a headline is a better representation of bias than the article itself. Sometimes articles are written in such a way that it sort of evokes a level of curiosity from the reader itself, and they are written to evoke some sort of bias. But when you go inside the article and actually read it, it turns out to be a pretty neutral article. So a headline is actually a good representation of bias. There was some limitations of the data set. I had to experiment with a variety of encoding techniques. Some encoding techniques failed to show any sort of pattern with respect to the data. So, question time. Do these sentences show any level of biases according to you? These are the sentences. So, as you can see, there are two publications. In fact, they're the same publication, but they're different editions of the same publication. The first headline says Bernie Sanders scored victories for years while legislative side doors. And the second headline says, via legislative side doors, Bernie Sanders won modest victories. Do you think there is a bias in this headline? You can all use the raise hand feature to tell me if you think there's a bias or not. It seems like none of you think that there is a bias in the sentence, but if you look at it from a sentimental evocation perspective, when you read the first one, it seems like Bernie Sanders has actually won something. It seems like a positive sort of a sentence. When you look at the second sentence, it says he won modest victories, which basically tries to minimize what he's won. So, though it's not a very negative sentence, it is not that positive as the first sentence, which means there's some bias with respect to how the publication wants people to perceive the story, though the actual story is the same exact thing, which means that if you actually read both the articles, they're going to be more similar than the headlines themselves. Some other problems to address in this experiment are these. Is the sentiment evoked from a headline enough to indicate some bias? As we went through certain examples, we saw that yes, a headline is sort of enough to evoke a sentiment and indicate some level of bias. Can a headline be considered a review of the state of affairs? So this is where you see the perspective that we are sort of coming from. We are using a sentiment encoder. So what does a sentiment sort of mean? All of you must have given reviews on multiple websites like Amazon or Alibaba.com. You've all given reviews, right? You've all also given ratings with those reviews. So every time you use a star system from 1 to 5, 1 means bad and 5 means good. And you also write a small paragraph telling the website why you like their service or not. What you're basically telling them is this natural language paragraph is what I feel. And the mathematical equivalent of that natural language is the stars that I'm sort of giving you. This is what a sentiment evoked from natural language sort of means. So can a headline be considered as a sentiment? Can a headline be considered a review of the state of affairs? Yes, it can. For example, in this case, the sentiment that is evoked from the first sentence is extremely positive. The sentiment that is evoked from the second sentence is not that positive. It could be considered neutral. Can a neural network be polarized if it were to learn from the perspective of a biased news consumer? This is the question that we are actually addressing in this problem statement. We are trying to find out if the neural network thinks that this particular news piece should not be trusted as much as this particular news piece. And does the category of a news a biased consumer trust completely affect their perception when it comes to fake news? So what we're trying to find out in the third and the fourth sentences, these are basically our problem statements for this experiment. In the first, what we're trying to find out is if a neural network can be as polarized as a person is in the perceived bias of news media. And the second question is, say a person is biased towards news media. Does that mean that they are more vulnerable to fake news or not? Because say I have been consuming news only from one end of the political spectrum, does that make me more vulnerable to fake news? Does that mean that I will go and believe more fake news than someone who consumes both ends of the political spectrum or believes all news media organizations? The methodology that I used was sentiment classification, which is the classical natural language problem. We have used Twitter feeds as well as Yelp reviews to build models, and these models were used to sort of encode our headlines into an encoding of sentences. The second one was a binary classification in the detection of a fake news, which is basically a binary classification which will just tell you whether the news is fake or not. The pipeline for the sentiment analysis looked like this. So we have 5 data sets. For each of the data sets, they were converted into Twitter Roberta-based modeling encoding, as well as Yelp BERT-based model encoding. These encodings were then fed to a variety of neural networks, which included CNNs, LSTMs, GRUs, BiLSTMs, and BiGRUs. You can see some examples here. So say there's a headline saying ABC Corp files for, and there's a sentence there. We convert that into its encoded form, and we have like a score. The score is the credence or the faith the neural network should have on that particular headline. That we took from the bias chart that we've seen before. For the fake news detection, we have the data sets. We also have a fake news data set because we have to compare each of these to the fake news data set. Again, we do some sort of a sentiment encoding using Twitter Roberta and Yelp BERT. And we have like a categorical comparison in a CNN, LSTM, and a GRU. These are some of the results that I obtained. So in the data that you can see that the observation was the only data set that could polarize the neural network was the EMNLP. The EMNLP was a data set that was not scored on the basis of a source of news, which did not rely on the slice. Instead, it had been hand annotated by annotators to detect the stance as left, right, or center. This means that while some level of polarization exists, there is no polarization on the basis of perceived bias as calculated by all slides in their surveys. Some news articles do take ideologically polarizing stance in the articles, but this is not true with respect to most of the articles. Secondly, hand annotated articles are the best data sets to conduct news media bias studies, as the neural networks seem to learn best from the features learned by these annotated data sets. The US COVID data set was more polarized than the UK COVID data set. For both the NELA 2017 dataset and all the news dataset, a filtered version of the dataset that included the keyword Trump polarized the neural network more than the non-filtered version. This points to the possibility that topical bias may exist in these publications and needs to be examined. For the fake news vulnerability, this is actually really good news. There were some interesting trends. All the categories for all the data sets are pretty much robust and are not vulnerable to fake news, which basically means that a neural network is easily able to determine whether the news is fake or not. For the UK COVID news data set, when we used Yelp embeddings, the vulnerability decreased for centrist news agencies. An opposite trend was observed for the US COVID news. Over there, the centrist news agency reporting had a lower accuracy when detecting fake news. This could be because of the way Yelp and Twitter Roberta model learned features, or it could be because the fake news that was sourced from the website thus spoof was US-centric. There's an interesting trend where the NELA 2017 dataset, when filtered on the keyword Trump, developed some level of vulnerability towards fake news, especially the extreme left-leaning news publications. So these are some of the observations. The best model that performed was an SVM and not a neural network. Very surprising. The most significant conclusion from this work is that though there is a perceived bias, when looked at from a neural network standpoint, it is actually quite negligible, very minimal. There may be topical biases, and most mainstream news agencies do not make the consumer vulnerable to believing fake news. It is safe to conclude that the perceived bias that stems from social media polarization is being extended to news media when the contribution to the polarization may be minimal. I just want to check how we're doing with time.
Well, about 1 minute, and
maybe we can open for questions quickly.
Yes. We do have a few minutes because we do have about 15 minutes between each session.
So should I cover my slides quickly? There's only a couple.
Anyone would like to ask any questions? If there's no question, yeah, Aroma, you might yeah, make some comments if you want.
I'll quickly tell you about the future work and the significance. The significance of this work is basically to be able to transform a social problem into a technical one, and to use whatever technology we have on our hands to try to solve it. Hopefully, these techniques will find deeper trends and will become mainstream and will help policymakers and general citizens approach news media bias in a better way. Some of the future work that we could do after this is to study the effect of news media on perceptron networks. We would use perceptron networks because those are the closest things to how a human brain sort of works. So if you want to map like a human brain bias to how it works in computers, perceptrons are more accurate than neural networks. We could use better annotated data sets to perform the bias analysis. We can study the effect of memory models on media bias. We can experiment on some of the most polarizing news epochs in time. And we can also do some significant studies on country level. I can see there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I have one question.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Yeah. What Python library or Python tools did you use to build your neural networks?
I use PyTorch.
PyTorch.
Yes.
Good. Any other questions?
In conclusion, I just want to say one small thing. It's like when we go out into the world, we have a lot of ways that we can consume information. Some of it is from mainstream news agencies. Some of it is from social media. If you follow someone on social media, sometimes they may comment on certain things that are actually occurring in real time. And the third one is there are also personal blogs or vlogs on YouTube, which sort of become a source for news for a lot of people. Out of these news agencies, though people have a bias, that people have a perceived bias, that news agencies actually are sort of biased when it comes to reporting. Mainstream news agencies and the mainstream articles that they write have minimal bias. The bias is actually a perception that creeps in because of the various sources that you are actually consuming news from. So a lot of the social media or like YouTube commentators also use some of the news snippets in their shows, and a lot of shows that that take place on even mainstream news agencies like CNN or Fox News are not actually news shows. If you go and check like the ratings of those shows, certain shows, they're actually entertainment shows. Like for example, there's a couple of people sitting, like 5 or 6 people sitting and viewing their opinions on a certain topic. Those are actually entertainment shows. Those are not news shows. So when it comes to media, mainstream news media is actually regularized well. They have like reporting agencies. If they publish something false, they can be sued very easily. So they are in general very careful. The proper mainstream registered sites, they are very careful about all of these things. I have a question. Yeah, it's
Yes.
from Suti. How can we know if the mainstream media got minimal level of bias, given the condition in HK is one-sided? That's true. When like I do not do any analysis on Chinese news media, I believe if the media is state-sponsored, you will have to take everything that they say with a pinch of salt, to be honest. Um, all of my work was done based on data from the UK and the US. Over there, news agencies are pretty much independent. So when it comes to those countries and those news organizations, I can say that the proper news organizations, their proper websites, and the shows that are certified as news shows and not entertainment shows, they have minimal bias. State media, you have to take everything with a pinch of salt, for sure. She has another question. I'm assuming you're a she. I do not know, to be honest. I apologize if I'm misgendering you. If we are to conduct a study in the Hong Kong media, what approach should we take? What should we be aware of? Yeah. So this is a very nice question. So what do you do when you're conducting this sort of a study in an environment where there is a state sponsored media? So say you want to find out if the state-sponsored media is biased or not. You go look. Now you cannot look at very local news from that perspective, but you should probably look for corresponding news in the international sections of other countries. Like for example, in UK, there's BBC, they have their international section. So they sometimes cover news from Hong Kong. Similarly, in the US, there may be various news agencies. They also have international sections. They will cover news from Hong Kong. So the way I filtered on the keyword Trump, you could filter on the keyword Hong Kong by collecting all of the news from these news agencies that are not inside your state purview, basically, and compare them. Basically, use like a neural network and try to find if there is any sort of a difference or a bias that already exists.
I think the time is about up, and we thank you, Aroma, for the very nice presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to me.
Yeah.
Hope you have a good conference, all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.